Without this tool, you shouldn't be all that surprised if your campaign falls into the ruins of boredom, as it really is the most powerful technique I've found to get my players to be engaged with my world and my campaigns. It hasn't failed me yet, and this strange-looking object I made is going to help me teach it to you. I'm going to walk you through the exact way I use it in my games and give you a few examples so you can use it yourself. But if we're going to cast compulsion on our players with the weirdest shaped wand you've ever seen, you should know that this tool isn't actually magic. It's more like a space laser, and you wouldn't operate a space laser without reading the instruction manual first. Right? We will come back to this later. So on the first page here, it says the first important thing we need to understand is what makes any game element compelling. And spoiler alert for this video, it's people, it's humans. Speaking of humans, by the way, hi, I'm Grant Breeze, and this place is Mossy Antler, where we find meaning in our games. But creating meaning in our games isn't always obvious. Clearly, you want your campaigns to be great experiences for your players. You wouldn't be here if you didn't care about that. And if you're anything like me, you want them to be memorable and meaningful too. So how do we make sure we do that? Well, if we can take as a baseline assumption that the meaning of life is other people, which we can, then we know which direction to aim.
This is the meaning of life.
Your players are other people. They're humans, and humans love teams. For good and for ill, it's evolutionarily built into us, like deep down. So that means you need to put teams in your games. The cooler, more mysterious, the more mysterious way of putting it is that your campaigns need factions. But it's not that simple. Without proper consideration and setup, factions will fall flat during play. Maybe you've created your own factions, given them some aesthetic, maybe even a goal, and you probably think of them as a collection of individuals. But if that's as far as we go, in my opinion, that misses what a faction actually is. It's propping up thin fabric with sticks, and that's bound to topple over, or be blown away by the tornado that is the PCs. Maybe you think of yourself as one individual in some faction in real life, but that is the exact problem. A faction is a nebulous thing. It's a concept, not something that can be directly pointed at. And that means you can't cleanly separate the parts from the whole. Like a brain is a collection of neurons. No single neuron can depict the greater whole by itself, and one neuron can't contribute all that much, but as a collective, ideas and actions form. You need all the neurons working together. Using this lens, we can start to see factions and relationships in a new light. The real world is chock full of these messy blobs of concepts and ideals and groups of people, and from experience, if your game doesn't have any of them, it can feel hollow. And that's not at all to say that you don't need individual NPCs within the groups that you create. You absolutely do. I talked a little bit about my approach to making NPCs in my Smart Prep video, but I will definitely make a more extensive video about how I create NPCs in the future, so you should subscribe to stick around to see that. And when we apply this kind of thinking to building our campaigns, we can easily see how factions drive the game forward. They act upon the world, filling the cracks and seams of that reality we're making. And as GMs, we can tie that directly into quests and story. In my last video, I mentioned that in this hobby, we don't have an obvious path forward, like a clearly marked road. We need an ATV and a terrain map. I'm trying to chart some of that terrain map because of how much this hobby means to me. If that resonates with you, that means it could with someone else too. So sharing this with your fellow GMs, leaving a little like, or writing a comment for me to read can help this reach more people, and that's also a fantastic way to support me. Or if you want to help me realize my dream of becoming a full-time creator and eventually making games for you to play, you can support me directly on Patreon, where you can get perks like reading my session lessons, early access to videos, or just hanging out with me in the monthly live stream. But there's also a free tier if you just want the occasional update. These videos take a lot of effort to make, so it'd mean a lot to me if you want to check it out. Okay, but back to tying factions directly to story. That's where our cube comes in. Honestly, I picked this because it was the closest thing to me that was square, but the more I thought about it, the more it ended up being a great metaphor for this. I gotta admit the space laser analogy isn't the best, because even though we are looking down from like a 10,000 mile viewpoint, what we're sending down isn't so much a laser as it is a four-corner tapestry. Our tool even has a mystical name, the Greymoss Square. It's also known as the Semiotic Square or the Square of Opposition. All of these names rule. Why isn't this more popular? And this is a leg to my couch that I made. And later I'll show you how it actually fits into my couch and explain why I needed to build it in the first place. But it's a square. Okay, it's a cube with nobules, but all of that will still be relevant. And now I'm holding it like a baby. By the way, do you know I put bloopers at the end of every video? Anyways, just like the sections of your brain, factions need to interact with each other, and one of the most interesting ways they can do that is through conflict. The factions, not the parts of your brain. Even if conflict is not what's central to your games, the square will still work with the other things that are central to humans. No narrative of any complexity can be built on or reduced to a single element. Conflict is one kind of behavior. There are others equally important in any human life, such as relating, finding, losing, bearing, discovering, parting, changing. Change is the universal aspect of all these sources of story. That is such a weird thing to be in a Space Laser manual, but it's important we read the manual. Now that I have, I can tell you that the square works like this. Each group has fundamental beliefs that don't align with the other groups. Each has fundamental assumptions about how the world works, and unless they sit down and talk it out, which unfortunately they probably won't do in most cases, they're going to disagree and think their way is the correct and only way. It almost seems like that's how it works in the real world too. We have the city nobles who delight in their comfortable seats in their ivory tower and enjoy their control over keeping things in order. We have the academy students who very much enjoy their ability to study because of that order. Then we have the lower classes in the city, maybe placed literally geographically below where the nobles live. Things are messy down there but feel alive and authentic. Last, we have the underworld criminals who take advantage of the chaos for their own gain. The academy students find some ancient magic that they're excited about harnessing, but the nobles see it as unnecessarily dangerous and want to restrict access to it. The magic would only add instability to the lower classes, so they don't need it, but the underworld criminals would absolutely love to get their hands on it for obvious reasons. But that's just how they're laid out. These are the labels we assign to them. The square shows the results of the work, not how the idea was created. So I'm going to tell you what I see as the most important piece of our puzzle, but just know that I'm going to use conflict as our narrative source of change in my examples, as that's often what we're looking for in our games. In John Truby's book, which is not a definitive text, but it is pretty damn good. You can pick it up from an affiliate link below. I gotta get paid. He lays it out as four-corner opposition. The idea is that the story drives itself forward if all of your factions or characters are in opposition to each other in some way. Each group has something that contradicts with the others. If things are set up just to be good versus evil, the conflict is obvious and it quickly gets stale, and it doesn't generate intricate interactions. Conflict that is structured in an elegant way like this creates interesting stories. For our purposes, these multiple layers of conflict give us GMs a greater number of avenues to explore and threads to harness. But the key to this isn't just that the factions are adversaries, but their values are in opposition. In any story where we see the characters' values clash, we automatically interpret that as the story's theme. It's what your story, or at least the conflict, is about. John Truby calls this the moral argument, which is a pretty good name for it, because many stories at their core are an argument about what is moral. You don't have to go as deep as making an actual moral argument, but also, why not? We are making art. Why shouldn't your art reflect the ways you see the world and show the ways you want it to be better? What is important to you? Put that in your games. And using themes in this way can convey what you believe without being heavy-handed. The NPCs within our factions don't need to give drawn-out monologues, they can just act and oppose others from acting. And from that, it will be obvious what they think about the world. Show, don't tell. Even if you want your games to be compelling without having some overarching parable, that's fine. This method is still a great way to do that. The takeaway is your themes reflect what the factions believe. So you start with 2 themes, and for each you make a determination about 2 ways people can feel about the themes. And that's how you determine your factions. So now I'll reveal a little twist on this tool, which is probably how it's typically used. We'll go through another couple examples from popular media, and I'll show you how I'm going to do it through my own prep of a future campaign. It'll be like a little case study. The twist is that you can slot a single NPC into each corner in your square instead of an entire faction. And you can slot multiple NPCs in the squares, like this example from Lord of the Rings, or this one from Andor. Have you seen the show? The show's amazing. You should watch Andor. I really like to reward people who stick around to watch everything, so because you've gotten this far, you get to know another key piece to using this in your games. The PCs should be on this square. Here's my more complicated example. The PCs will be in a small, close-knit organization of problem solvers that do detective work. This will take some player buy-in, but I don't think I'll have any problem with that. The organization will believe two things, and that's where I'm going to get my themes, namely that the organization supports each other, and they think they can solve problems better together than any individual can. That's something I believe. I want my second theme to be about the tension of the value of using reason instead of emotions, and explore that space. In real life, I believe we need both in full measure, but the organization that the party will be in will staunchly believe that only reason gives you answers. And they have a code that they strictly follow as the best way to do that. It'll be something like a fantasy scientific method. I'll figure that out later. And now, here's the complicated part. I'm going to add a third theme. That's when our square becomes a cube. So we'll need to map it a little bit differently onto 2D space because a third theme means 4 factions become 8. So the first theme is about how to best solve problems. The second theme is about what we should be using to solve those problems. And the third theme will be about who we're solving the problems for. Here's what that looks like in full. There is a little write-up with details in a standalone free Patreon post, link in the doobly-doo. To make things more real, you want to make each viewpoint seem as reasonable as possible. Just remember that opposing motivations is what creates the conflict. Your themes create the internal motivations of the factions and NPCs on your square. And that is a very solid leg for our campaign to sit on. All of the quests and stories you create can hook directly into it because you know why each faction is acting the way they do. I made a template with all the examples from this video, link in the doobly-doo, but even if the factions in your game weren't set up this way to begin with, now that you're an expert on the Grandma Square, you can map existing factions or NPCs onto it easily. But there's a truth to this technique that you should know about. When I think back to the most tense or satisfying conflicts in my campaigns, they are a direct result of me using this tool. But it won't fix everything. A great campaign is an amalgamation of many strong pieces fitting together. But mistakes can still happen, so I made this whole video sharing my own mistakes so you can avoid them. If you like this shirt, you can get your own and other cool shirts at mossyantler.com. Now go create some amazing factions in your games. And remember, there's always a path forward. Now go find it.
Or are we just simply spiraling coils of self-replicating DNA?